It was the night of May 31st, 1902. A great storm had moved in over Suffolk, the county in the east of England, a landscape of flat fields and river estuaries and small market towns and villages that have been there since before the Domesday Book. The rain was heavy. Lightning split the sky above Peasenhall, a village of perhaps 600 souls on the road between Saxmund and Halesworth, and the thunder came rolling in so loud and so close that nobody in the village was sleeping easily. At Providence House, on the main street, a 23-year-old domestic servant named Rose Harsent was awake. She had left a candle burning in the kitchen. She had, apparently, been expecting someone. Someone came. In the early hours of June 1st, 1902, Rose Harsent was stabbed to death. Her throat was cut so deeply that she was nearly decapitated. She had multiple gashes on her shoulders. She had stab wounds. Her nightdress was burned and parts of her body were charred. Someone had tried to set fire to her remains, apparently to destroy evidence. She had been dead for approximately 4 hours when her father found her at around 6 in the morning, lying in a pool of blood at the bottom of the kitchen stairs. She was 6 months pregnant. The village had one obvious suspect. Everyone knew who it was. The circumstantial evidence pointed in one direction, clearly and consistently. The man was arrested. He was tried twice, at Ipswich Assizes, before juries of his peers. Neither jury could agree a verdict. He walked free. He lived for another 39 years. He died in 1941, in London, at the age of 74, having moved away from the village that knew him. He was never convicted. He was never formally exonerated. The case against him was eventually dropped not because new evidence cleared him, but because the prosecution decided a third jury would be as divided as the first two. The murder of Rose Harsent has never been solved. 3 questions will follow us through this story today. What happened in Providence House on the night of May 31st, 1902, and who was the person that Rose Harsent had left a candle burning for? How did a village in which everyone knew everyone, in which the affair between the suspect and the victim had been common knowledge for over a year, in which the circumstantial evidence was substantial, how did that village produce 2 hung juries and allow a man everyone suspected to walk free? And what does the Peasenhall murder reveal about Edwardian English village life, about the gap between what a community knows and what it is prepared to say aloud, under oath, in a court of law? Before we go further, if this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, the subscribe button is just below this video. We cover true crime from around the world, told with the detail and care it deserves. No sensationalism. No rushing through the facts. Just the full story, properly told. Hit subscribe, and you won't miss the next one. To understand the murder of Rose Harsent, we have to understand the village where it happened, and the man at the center of it. Because this case was not made on a single stormy night in May 1902. It was made over the year before it, in a chapel, in a garden, in letters, and in the whispered conversations of 600 people who lived within sight of each other and knew more than they ever said. Peasenhall is a village of the kind that Edwardian England produced by the thousand, small, self-contained, hierarchical. Everyone in Peasenhall in 1902 knew everyone else. They knew their neighbors' incomes, their domestic arrangements, their religious affiliations, their reputations. The social fabric of the village was maintained by proximity and by gossip, and both were relentless. The village's primary employer was Smith & Sons, an agricultural engineering company that manufactured seed drills, the machines used to plant crops in rows. The seed drill works was the economic heart of Peasenhall. The men who worked there were the backbone of the village's working and lower middle class. The foreman of the works was a man named William Gardner. The village had several churches. The primitive Methodist chapel in nearby Sibton was where William Gardner worshipped, led the choir, ran the Sunday school, and exercised the kind of lay authority that made him a figure of genuine standing in the community. In an Edwardian village, a man who was foreman at the works and Sunday school superintendent at the chapel was someone. He had arrived from the workhouse and risen by application and piety to a position of real local respectability. He was not gentry. Nobody in Peasenhall was gentry, but he was about as close to it as a working man could reasonably get. He was 35 years old. He had been married for 14 years to a woman named Georgina. They had 6 living children. He lived on the main street of the village, in a small semi-detached cottage that was, as the prosecution would later note at trial, within direct line of sight of Providence House. Rose Harsent was 23 years old in the spring of 1902. She was the daughter of William Harsent, a local man of modest means. She had been employed as a domestic servant at Providence House, the home of William and Lucy Crisp, substantial members of the local community, for several years. She was, by all contemporary accounts, attractive, sociable, and well-liked in the village. She sang in the primitive Methodist choir, the same choir that William Gardner led. She spent her spare time in the social orbit of the chapel, as most people of her age and class did in a village where the church provided the primary framework for social life. She was also, it would emerge, in possession of a collection of letters of a distinctly unusual character. Among her belongings, after her death, the police found a quantity of correspondence, some of it quite explicit in its content, from a man referred to in one account only as Davis. The identity of Davis was never definitively established. It is possible that Davis was a name used to disguise the real sender's identity. It is possible that Davis was an entirely separate figure from William Gardner, one whose existence complicates the simple narrative the prosecution later constructed. Rose Harsent had, in other words, a life more complicated than the simple picture of a servant girl and her choirmaster suggested. The event that made the Peasenhall murder possible, that created the poisoned atmosphere in which it occurred, happened not in 1902 but in May 1901, a full year before Rose was killed. On an evening in May 1901, two young men of the village, Alphonso Skinner and George Wright, were at a loose end on the main street when they noticed Rose Harsent entering the doctor's chapel, a small outbuilding associated with the local church. They noticed, shortly afterwards, that William Gardner followed her in. Skinner and Wright, apparently finding the situation irresistible, went to the wall of the chapel and listened. What they heard was, by their later testimony, unmistakable. They heard sounds consistent with a sexual encounter. They heard Rose yelp, "Oh, oh," and then laugh. They heard her tell Gardner that she had been reading in the Bible about what they had just been doing. She was referring to the 38th chapter of Genesis, which concerns the sexual act of Onan. They heard other things they described in court with the careful vocabulary of men who had memorized their lines. Skinner and Wright could hardly wait to tell everyone in Peasenhall what they had heard. The scandal spread through the village with the speed that only a community of 600 people can achieve. The chapel community was horrified. Gardner was a married man, a Sunday school superintendent, a man of piety and standing. Rose was a single woman of the choir. The combination was, by the standards of Edwardian Methodist respectability, catastrophic. Gardner denied everything with righteous fury. He wrote a letter to Rose, a letter that was later found among her possessions and that would become one of the central pieces of evidence in the murder trial, in which he addressed the scandal and their correspondence about it. The Reverend Guy, who investigated the chapel scandal on behalf of the congregation, concluded that the matter was a trumped-up case lacking sufficient evidence. No formal disciplinary action was imposed beyond a temporary suspension from some of his duties, from which he was reinstated within a month. The congregation was divided. The village was not placated. The gossip continued. And then, in May 1902, another letter appeared. Among the evidence found at the scene of Rose's murder, or recovered from her possessions, was a letter. The letter was unsigned. It was written on a piece of paper that had been torn from a larger sheet. It read, in substance, "Come to the back door tonight at midnight, as I want to see you on something important. There will be a light in the kitchen window." This letter was, for the prosecution, crucial. It showed that someone had arranged a midnight meeting with Rose at Providence House on the night she was killed. Someone who knew the layout of the house well enough to specify the back door. Someone who knew about the kitchen window. The paper on which the letter was written was, the prosecution argued, consistent with paper used at Smith & Sons, the sea drill works where William Gardner was foreman. A torn corner of what appeared to be similar paper was found, or alleged to have been found, in Gardner's possession. The defense would challenge the provenance of this evidence vigorously. The circumstances in which the paper corner was said to have been discovered were not entirely clear. The chain of custody was imperfect. But the letter itself, the arranged midnight meeting, was a piece of evidence the prosecution placed at the very center of its case. The night of May 31st, 1902, was stormy enough to provide cover for almost anything. The thunder was loud. The rain was heavy. The lightning made looking out of windows pointless. You could see nothing but your own reflection. Rose had been seen earlier in the day, apparently in reasonable spirits. She had been to the pharmacy, or someone had been to the pharmacy on her behalf, to collect medicine in a small amber prescription bottle for a condition consistent with pregnancy. That prescription bottle was found at the murder scene, smashed on the kitchen floor. It would later be identified as having contained paraffin, an accelerant, brought to the scene by the killer to help burn the body. The body was found by Rose's father, William Harsent, at approximately 6 in the morning of June 1st. He had come to bring her clean linen. He found the kitchen door unlocked. He found his daughter at the bottom of the stairs. The evidence at the scene told a story of a meeting arranged, a confrontation, a killing, and then a clumsy, unsuccessful attempt to burn the body that was interrupted, perhaps by the realization that the fire was not taking hold adequately, or by the fear of discovery, and abandoned. The killer had left through the back door and walked, most probably, a very short distance to their home. The evidence at Providence House told investigators several things with reasonable certainty. Rose had been expecting her visitor. The candle was burning. The back door was unlocked. She had come downstairs to meet someone, probably willingly. There was no evidence of a forced entry, no broken window, no damaged lock. She had admitted the person herself. Whatever then happened between them at the bottom of those kitchen stairs, the outcome was extreme violence. The severity of the injuries to Rose's throat and shoulders was not consistent with a brief struggle or a single act. It suggested sustained attack, or an attack begun with intent to kill from the first blow. The stab wounds and gashes, combined with the throat wound, indicated that whoever had killed Rose had wanted to be certain she was dead. The attempt to burn the body was less successful. The paraffin in the prescription bottle had been poured, or had been accidentally broken and spilled, and some fire had been set. But the fire had not taken hold. The body was charred in places but not destroyed. The evidence was not eliminated. A gamekeeper named James Morris, who had been walking on Peasenhall's main road at about 5 in the morning of June 1st, testified at trial that he had seen a set of muddy footprints in the road consistent with someone who had recently crossed wet ground at the back of Providence House. The footprints were not preserved or cast. Their relevance was disputed. William Gardner was arrested on June 3, 1902, 2 days after the body was discovered. The case against him was circumstantial but substantial. He had been connected to Rose Harsent by the chapel scandal of the previous year, a connection that was, in the village's understanding, almost certainly sexual. He was alleged to be the father of her unborn child. He lived within direct sight of Providence House. The prescription bottle found at the scene was identified as having been obtained from a pharmacy where medicine had been prescribed, and Gardner's wife, Georgina, claimed she had given Rose a prescription bottle containing medicine, which Rose might have later refilled with paraffin. This was Georgina's explanation for the bottle, an explanation that required the jury to believe a chain of events that could either be true or could be convenient. A knife found in Gardner's possession had what appeared to be blood on it. Gardner's explanation was that he had used the knife to kill a rabbit. A bonfire had been lit at his property around the time of the murder. His explanation was that the bonfire was for ordinary domestic purposes. The letter found near Rose's body, the unsigned midnight appointment note, was argued by the prosecution to have been written by Gardner. The handwriting comparison evidence was contested and inconclusive. None of this evidence was, on its own, decisive. Together, it painted a picture that was deeply suggestive. But suggestion is not proof. And 2 juries, hearing this evidence, were unable to reach agreement. The gaps in the prosecution's case were significant and the defense exploited them methodically. No witness had seen William Gardner at or near Providence House on the night of the murder. This is striking. Peasenhall was a small village. The murder happened on the main street. Even in a thunderstorm, even at midnight, the absence of any witness placing Gardner at the scene was a genuine weakness. The handwriting evidence on the midnight appointment letter was not definitive. Expert witnesses disagreed about whether Gardner had written it. The paper comparison, The torn corner, said to match paper from Smith & Sons, was challenged on grounds of custody and reliability. The blood on the knife was not typed or matched. The forensic science of 1902 was not capable of connecting blood evidence to a specific individual. A rabbit had been killed with that knife, or so Gardner said, and the defense noted that the prosecution could not disprove it. And the identity of the father of Rose's child was never definitively established. The prosecution assumed it was Gardner. This was consistent with the chapel scandal. But the letters from Davis, whoever Davis was, introduced the possibility of another man in Rose's life, another person with a possible motive, whose identity was never fully investigated. The prosecution had a strong circumstantial case and no direct evidence. It was enough, apparently, to convince 11 of the 12 jurors in the first trial. It was not enough to convince the same proportion in the second. I want to stop here and ask you something directly. You are a juror in 1902. You live in the county where this case is being tried. You may well know the village, or know people from it, or know people who know people from it. You have heard the circumstantial evidence. You have heard that no witness placed Gardner at the scene. You have heard that the handwriting evidence is contested and the blood evidence is inconclusive. You have heard his wife's explanations for the bottle, the knife, and the bonfire. You have heard the chapel scandal from a year earlier. Do you convict? Drop your answer in the comments. And think about what it would mean to convict a man, a husband and father of 6 children, a man you might encounter in the street for the rest of your life in a community where everyone knows everyone, on circumstantial evidence alone. Because the 12 men who sat on the first jury could not agree. And then 11 of the 12 on the second jury said not guilty. And the same evidence, presented twice, produced opposite results. What changed? That question is the heart of this case. The investigation into Rose Harsent's murder was conducted by the Suffolk Constabulary, with some assistance from more senior investigators. It was, by the standards of Edwardian provincial policing, reasonably thorough, but it was working with the forensic science of 1902, which was limited in ways that mattered enormously for this case. Blood could not be typed. Fingerprinting was in its infancy and not routinely applied to crime scenes. The handwriting comparison that was central to the prosecution's case was a discipline then conducted by expert witnesses whose qualifications and methods varied enormously and whose conclusions were routinely challenged. The investigation also had to contend with a village that was divided. Peasenhall had known about the chapel scandal for a year. People had formed views about William Gardner and about Rose Harsent. Some of those views favored the prosecution's theory. Some favored the defense. The village was not a neutral source of information. The prescription bottle found at the scene was one piece of evidence the investigation pursued carefully. Its provenance, where it had come from, how it had come to be at Providence House filled with paraffin rather than medicine, was a puzzle. Gardner's wife's explanation was elaborate but not impossible. The prosecution found it convenient rather than credible. The first trial of William Gardner opened at Ipswich Assizes on November 7, 1902. The case was presided over by Mr. Justice Sir William Grantham. The prosecution was led by Ernest Wilde. The defense was led by Ernest Elliot. The trial lasted 3 days. The prosecution presented its circumstantial case methodically. The chapel scandal, the midnight appointment letter, the prescription bottle, the knife, the bonfire, the proximity of Gardner's house to Providence House, the alleged paternity of Rose's unborn child. The defense presented alternative explanations for each piece of evidence. The bottle had been given to Rose as medicine. Rose had filled it with paraffin herself, for lighting purposes. The knife was used for rabbiting. The bonfire was domestic. The letter had not been proven to be in Gardner's handwriting. No witness had placed him at the scene. His wife confirmed he had been in bed at home all night. Georgina Gardner's testimony was the most powerful element of the defense. She was a woman who had every reason to believe, or at least to suspect, that her husband had been unfaithful with Rose Harsent. The chapel scandal of 1901 had been, for a married woman with 6 children, a profound humiliation. And yet she sat in that witness box and defended him on every point, systematically and without apparent hesitation. Whether Georgina Gardner believed what she said or said what she needed to say to save her husband and her family is a question the trial could not answer and history has not settled. The jury retired. They deliberated. After an extended period, they reported that they could not agree on a verdict. The judge ordered a retrial. 11 jurors had voted for conviction. 1 had voted for acquittal. Between the first and second trials, something happened in Peasenhall that the formal record captures only partially. The village had watched the first trial. It had followed the proceedings in the newspapers. It had discussed the evidence around every kitchen table, in every shop, in every gathering of neighbors. The people of Peasenhall had formed their views. And the views were complicated. William Gardner was known to them not just as a suspect but as a man who had worked alongside some of them, who had led their children in Sunday school, who had a wife and 6 children who were entirely innocent of anything. To convict Gardner was not an abstract act of justice. It was an act that would play out in the village street every day thereafter. The pressure on potential witnesses, not formal pressure, not threats, but the pressure of community, of proximity, of the knowledge that you would have to live with these people afterwards, is not documented in the trial records. It is present, unmistakably, in the shape of what the second trial produced. The second trial opened at Ipswich Assizes on January 20, 1903. It was presided over by a different judge, Mr. Justice Sir John Compton Lawrence. The prosecution was led this time by Henry Dickens, the son of the novelist Charles Dickens, a barrister who had followed his father into literature and his own path into law. No significant new evidence had emerged in the 2 months between the trials. The same witnesses were called. The same arguments were made. The same documents were presented. But the jury responded differently. When the second jury retired and deliberated, they returned a different division from the first. The first jury had been 11-1 for conviction. The second jury was 11-1 for acquittal. This is, on the same evidence, a complete reversal of the collective judgment of 12 men. It is one of the most striking facts in the entire case. The evidence had not changed. The witnesses had not changed. The arguments had not changed. What had changed was the composition of the jury, the passage of time, and the social atmosphere of a community in which the living man, his pathetically loyal wife, his 6 children, his long face through 2 trials, had become more present, more sympathetic, more impossible to send to the gallows than the dead woman at the bottom of the kitchen stairs, who was, after all, already gone. After the second verdict, or non-verdict, the prosecution faced a decision. They could seek a third trial. The law permitted it. The evidence had not changed. The same circumstantial case could be presented to a third jury. The prosecution declined. The Attorney General issued a writ of nolle prosequi, a formal statement that the prosecution would not proceed further. Gardner was freed. This is the second major reversal in the case, not an acquittal, not an exoneration. Simply a decision that a third jury would be as divided as the first 2, that the expenditure of further legal resources was not warranted, and that the case should be allowed to die. Gardner was freed. He and Georgina and the 6 children left Peasenhall as quickly as they could arrange it. They moved to London, to Norwood, in South London, where they rebuilt their lives in the anonymity that only a large city can provide. He worked as a carpenter in London. He lived quietly. He did not speak publicly about the case. He died in 1941 at the age of 74. He had been suspected of killing Rose Harsent for the last 39 years of his life. He had never been convicted. He had never been formally cleared. The third reversal in this case is the one that receives the least attention, but that may matter most. Among Rose's possessions, the police found letters from a man referred to as Davis. The content of these letters was explicitly sexual, explicit enough that they were described in court as obscene letters. The identity of Davis was never definitively established. There were suggestions at trial that Davis might be a local man whose address was adjacent to Providence House, a man who had access to the back of the property, who would have known the layout of the house, who might have had a relationship with Rose quite separate from anything involving William Gardner. The prosecution did not pursue the Davis identification vigorously. Their theory required Gardner as the father of the child and the author of the midnight letter. Davis was an inconvenience to that theory. The defense raised Davis but did not fully develop the alternative suspect theory, partly because pointing to someone else was a strategy that could backfire if Davis could be established and then cleared. The result was that a figure who may have been central to what happened in Providence House on the night of May 31st, 1902, was never fully investigated, never identified beyond a possibly pseudonymous initial, and disappeared from the case into the shadows of a village that was not going to volunteer more information than it had to. The Peasenhall murder is, in some ways, less a case about who killed Rose Harsent than a case about how a community processes a crime committed within itself. Peasenhall in 1902 was not a community without opinion. The village had very definite views about William Gardner and about Rose Harsent and about what had probably happened between them and in that kitchen. Those views were expressed in the gossip, in the chapel community's response to the 1901 scandal, in the social ostracism that followed Gardner's arrest. But a view, shared informally around kitchen tables and across garden fences, is not the same thing as testimony. Testimony is sworn. Testimony has consequences. Testimony means standing up in a court of law in a county town and saying, in front of the suspect's wife and children and neighbors and the press, what you believe to be true. The gap between what Peasenhall knew and what Peasenhall was willing to say in a court of law is the gap that William Gardner walked through twice. This is not unique to Peasenhall. It is a pattern that appears in village crimes throughout the Victorian and Edwardian periods, and in community crimes of all kinds, in all eras. The community closes around what it knows because the cost of saying it is borne personally, daily, in the street. The cost of not saying it is borne abstractly, by the dead. Rose Harsent was already dead. William Gardner and Georgina and the 6 children were very alive. Georgina Gardner's role in this case has not received the attention it deserves. She testified for her husband in both trials, providing alibis, alternative explanations for the physical evidence, and the kind of absolute, unwavering spousal support that the defense relied upon. Her testimony was, by all accounts, delivered with complete composure and consistent detail. She was a woman who had been publicly humiliated by the chapel scandal of 1901. She had been the wife of a man whose affair with a choir member had been gossiped throughout the village for a year. She had 6 children under the age of 14. She was entirely dependent on her husband's income and her community standing. Whether Georgina Gardner told the truth is something only she could have known. Whether she told the truth, or told what was necessary, or had genuinely convinced herself that her husband was innocent, all 3 of these possibilities are consistent with the composed, detailed, unwavering testimony she gave. The jury in the first trial was apparently unmoved by her evidence. The jury in the second trial apparently found her more convincing. The passage of time, the sympathy generated by 2 trials, the visible loyalty of a wife who would not abandon her husband, these things had an effect that the evidence itself did not have on its own. Rose Harsent is, in most accounts of this case, a passive figure. The victim, the dead woman at the bottom of the stairs, the unmarried servant girl 6 months pregnant by an unspecified man. She was more than this, and she deserves more than this. She was 23 years old. She was employed in a position of relative stability, working for a respectable family in the village where she had grown up. She had a social life centered on the chapel, on the choir, on the friendships of a young woman in a small community. She read the Bible closely enough to make literary allusions in conversation. She maintained correspondence, some of it apparently quite adventurous in content, with at least one man beyond William Gardner. She had agreed to a midnight meeting on the night she died. She had opened the back door. She had come downstairs in her nightdress with a candle burning. She had trusted whoever was coming to the door. That trust was her last act. Whatever her relationship with Gardner, whatever the identity of the father of her child, whatever the content of the Davis letters, Rose Harsent was a young woman who was killed in her employer's kitchen on a stormy night by someone she apparently did not fear. The violence of her death, in such contrast to the ordinary trust of that unlocked door, is the thing that sits with me longest about this case. She was 6 months pregnant. The baby died with her. Neither of them received justice. The Peasenhall murder is, at its deepest, a case about the difference between social knowledge and legal proof. It is a case about a community that had all the informal information necessary to understand what had happened, and lacked either the evidence or the will to translate that understanding into a verdict. This gap, between what everyone knows and what can be proven, is one of the defining features of crimes committed in close communities. The investigative tools of 1902 were not capable of bridging it. There was no DNA. There was no reliable forensic blood analysis. There was no fingerprint database. There was contested handwriting comparison and a prescription bottle and a knife that might have killed a rabbit. Against this, the defense had only to raise doubt. And doubt, in a community of 600 people who knew the suspect, was not difficult to raise. The case also reveals something about the position of working-class women in Edwardian England that the trial records make visible without quite saying directly. Rose Harsent was a domestic servant. She was a young woman of no particular social standing, no family wealth, no influential advocates. She was pregnant and unmarried. In the social vocabulary of 1902, this placed her in a category that made the full weight of the justice system somewhat harder to apply on her behalf. The man accused of killing her was a person of standing, a foreman, a lay preacher, a Sunday school superintendent, a man with a wife and 6 children. The social asymmetry between the victim and the suspect shaped the atmosphere of both trials in ways that the formal record does not acknowledge but that the outcomes make legible. William Gardner moved to Norwood in South London with Georgina and the children in the spring of 1903. He found work as a carpenter. He lived quietly. He did not, by any documented account, speak publicly about the Peasenhall case. He lived until July 1941. He was 74 years old when he died. He had spent 39 years as a free man, a man who had never been convicted of anything, who had left behind the village that knew him, who had rebuilt something like an ordinary life in the anonymity of a large city. Whether he was guilty, whether the village of Peasenhall harbored a man who had killed a young woman and her unborn child, is something that the legal record cannot answer and the historical record cannot now resolve. The evidence that existed in 1902 was never sufficient to produce a conviction. The evidence that might have resolved the question, the identity of Davis, the definitive paternity of Rose's child, a witness who could have placed Gardner at the scene, was never found, or never came forward, or no longer exists. He died without confessing. He died without being exonerated. He died in the same state in which he had lived for nearly 4 decades, not guilty, not innocent, in the liminal space between the two that the Peasenhall murder had created for him and from which he had never entirely escaped. Peasenhall continued as a village. The people who had been central to the case, the Crisp family at Providence House, the neighbors, the chapel congregation, went on with their lives. The doctor who had initially suggested suicide, the pharmacist who had supplied the prescription bottle, the 2 young men whose eavesdropping had started the entire chain of events, all of them lived out ordinary lives in the ordinary way. Wright and Skinner, the 2 who had listened at the wall of the doctor's chapel in May 1901, had set in motion, by their eavesdropping and their subsequent gossip, a chain of events that ended with a dead woman at the bottom of a kitchen staircase and a village that would never entirely shed the case. Whether they felt, in later life, any particular weight of responsibility for the role their curiosity had played is not recorded. The village of Peasenhall still exists. Providence House still stands on the main street. It is marked, in the local consciousness, by what happened there in 1902. The case is, in Suffolk, a persistent presence, discussed in local histories, marked with a degree of civic pride in the particularity of unsolved mysteries, and remembered each year when those who care about such things note the anniversary of the storm. Rose Harsent is buried in the local churchyard. Flowers have been left on her grave in recent years. Judging by the flowers, Rose is still remembered in Peasenhall. The Peasenhall murder entered the cultural life of England in ways that its participants could not have anticipated. It was one of the cases included in the notable British trials series, the definitive Victorian and Edwardian collection of major criminal trials, which served as both legal record and popular reading material. The trial transcript, edited by W. Henderson, was published in 1907. The case attracted the attention of crime writers throughout the 20th century. It had everything that the genre required: a small, closed community, a single obvious suspect, an absence of conclusive evidence, 2 trials producing contradictory results, and an ending that offered no resolution. It inspired, among other things, a novel and several dramatic adaptations. Writers found in the Peasenhall case a parable about the limits of justice, about the way communities protect their own, about the gap between knowledge and proof. It is a case that sits in the tradition of the English village mystery, the tradition that Agatha Christie would later codify and popularize, the tradition of the closed community with something hidden at its center. But unlike Christie's fictional villages, Peasenhall did not provide a detective capable of finding the answer. Peasenhall provided only the question. It was the night of May 31st, 1902. A storm moved in over Suffolk. A young woman unlocked a back door and came downstairs in her nightdress, a candle burning in the kitchen window. She had arranged to meet someone, or someone had arranged to meet her. She trusted enough to open the door. She was found 6 hours later by her father, who had come to bring her clean linen. 2 juries, hearing the same evidence, reached opposite conclusions. The man everyone suspected walked free and lived for 39 more years. The village that knew closed around what it knew and carried it in silence until all the people who might have said something with certainty were gone. The question of who killed Rose Harsent has been argued about for over a century. It will probably be argued about for as long as anyone is interested in the particular combination of elements this case provides: the storm, the chapel, the gossip, the midnight letter, the divided juries, the closed village, the long life of the man who was never convicted. William Gardner is the most probable answer. The circumstantial evidence points at him clearly and consistently. The chapel scandal, the midnight appointment note, the prescription bottle, the proximity, the motive, the wife who explained everything so carefully. But probable is not the same as proven. And in criminal law, probable is not enough. The Peasenhall murder remains officially unsolved. It is the most stubbornly unanswered question in the criminal history of a county that has had its share of them. The village kept it secret. The courts could not unlock it. The back door of Providence House opened on the night of May 31st, 1902, for the last time. Nobody who could say with certainty who was on the other side of it ever did. Rose Harsent was 23 years old. She had grown up in Peasenhall, the same village where she died, on the same street where she had always lived, among the same people she had always known. She had never been anywhere very far. She had never needed to be. The village was her world, and she had made something warm and full inside it. She sang. That is what people remembered about her first. She sang in the choir at the Primitive Methodist Chapel, and people who heard her said she had a voice worth hearing. She gave it freely, the way people give things when they do not yet know that generosity has a cost. She read the Bible carefully enough to know which passages were beautiful and which were troubling and which were both at once. She had a mind that paid attention, that held what it found, that reached for meaning in the words in front of her. She was not educated in the formal sense that the era reserved for people of other classes. She was educated in the deeper sense. She thought about what she read. She made connections. She understood more than the world around her gave her credit for. She was a domestic servant. She cleaned houses and carried coal and cooked food and made beds for other people, and she did it in the house at the end of her own street, within sight of everything she had ever known. It was not a large life by any measure the world uses to count such things. But it was hers. It was entirely and specifically hers. She had friends. She had family. A father who loved her enough to come to her with clean linen on an ordinary Sunday morning, and who instead found what he found. She had plans. In the way that 23-year-olds always have plans, even if those plans are not yet fully formed, even if they are still more feeling than thought. She was going to have a child. Whatever the circumstances of that pregnancy, whatever the complexity and the difficulty and the social weight it carried, a child was coming. A life that had not yet begun was going to begin. Neither of them got to begin it. She left a candle burning in the kitchen window because she trusted. That is the detail that stays with me. She unlocked the back door and came downstairs in her nightdress in the middle of a thunderstorm because she believed the person she was meeting was someone she did not need to fear. That trust was the last thing she gave. The village went on. The trials came and went. The juries could not agree. The man most people suspected walked free and lived for 39 more years and died in London as an ordinary man. The newspapers found other cases to fill their columns. The years turned into decades and the decades into a century and the century into a question that nobody could answer. But Rose is still there. In the churchyard in Peasenhall. People still leave flowers on her grave. Over 120 years later, People who never knew her and were born long after she died still come to the place where she is buried and leave something behind. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the only justice available to her now, that she is not forgotten, that the flowers keep coming, that her name is still said out loud, that the story of what happened to her is still being told, and told carefully, by people who think it matters. It matters. Rose Harsent was 23 years old. She sang in a choir. She read her Bible. She left a candle burning in a kitchen window on a stormy night in May because she trusted. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to have her child. She deserved a verdict. She got none of these things, but she is still remembered. In Peasenhall, where the flowers keep coming. And here, tonight. Subscribe to Enter the Crime for true crime told with the rigor it deserves. Tell us in the comments, do you think William Gardner did it? And what does it say about justice that an entire village could know and a verdict could never be reached?